The novel sport of fishing. This ancient, legendary activity is enjoyed by all walks of life, ranging in purpose from catching your next meal to leisurely passing the time. More recently, however, fishing has found a place as a virtual activity in Pokemon, alongside countless other video games willing to put a rod in the player's hands. And it's a perfect match. Fishing minigames are great as fun little time wasters, but also a useful way to pick up in-game resources like food and money, not to mention the potential for an extra sprinkle of world building here and there. As games of all kinds see anglers join the ranks of their world's characters, there is so much pageantry and ceremony baked into video game fishing that keeps us coming back for it again and again. We can attend vibrant and high-stakes fishing contests with prizes and bragging rights all on the line. You've got deep and intricate mechanical systems with quests, equipment, and skill trees. And there's even unique and exciting interactions, events, and even boss fights. Oh god, and then all of that on top of the passionate and driven fishing enthusiasts. And specifically in Pokemon, it's this aspect of things that I have a particular fascination with. Because I really have to wonder, what do Pokemon fishermen actually do? Well, they presumably fish, of course, but think about it. This is a world and universe where all the normal conventions of fishing would be warped and twisted. This is a seemingly post-scarcity society that doesn't really require hunting for food in any capacity. Fishing NPCs live up to this idea as well, as the vast majority of them don't really seem interested in the task as a food source, all of which on top of the various taboos regarding the eating and selling of Pokemon. Not to say that those things never happen, but most cases in the games appear to be frowned upon. But despite all of that, these are some of the most passionate characters in the series, dedicated soldiers who are devoted to performing and spreading the art of fishing. And therefore I, or should I say we at this point, have to ask the question, what is it that makes them so immersed in their craft? What sort of culture has to be in place here to lead way to such a dedicated community? And what do the intricacies of fishing look like in a world that is so deeply separated from the real-world tenets of said activity? All of these incredible questions and more will be answered on today's latest and greatest Pokemon investigation, as we perform a societal diagnostic of sorts on fishing within the Pokemon universe, and really try to see what makes these characters tick. As always, only the mainline games are on the table for evidence, but everything is fair game when it comes to speculation. So with all that said, let's head to the pond, cast our line, and see what we reel in. So with the goal of tackling this group of characters at large, we should probably start with the massive proverbial elephant in the room with the eating and selling of Pokemon. Because this is a whole can of worms I'm really not that interested in opening, many brilliant YouTubing minds and brave Redditors have tackled this concept in much greater depth than I would ever hope to, I want to stay laser focused on our topic here: fish Pokemon and fish NPCs. We are in this theory crafting neck of the woods to answer one question. What sort of relationship do Pokemon fishers and their fish have as hunters and prey? The first place I always look when it comes to empiricals like this is my trusty Pokédex. We can actually pull a pretty decent amount of information on the specific subject straight from the encyclopedia, but the documentation is also interestingly sort of shifty and vague, so it's ripe for analysis. There are a couple of fish that are outright stated to be eaten by humans, these being Wishy-Washy in Sun and Moon and Barraskewda in Sword and Shield. Both are straightforwardly described as being tasty and seem to be open and shut cases. More interestingly, however, a large chunk of entries that mention the subject describe the process as something that used to happen in the past, or that the Pokemon produces an edible byproduct and no real harm is required. Entries such as Sharpedo, Lapras, and Basculin use the past tense to describe consumption, poaching, and overfishing as things that were common in the past but are now no longer acceptable, with Sharpedo and Lapras entries giving particular emphasis to how heinous it is to hurt these creatures. Other entries like Slowpoke, Clauncher, and Veluza describe how certain body parts will molt or naturally detach and then are harmlessly picked up by humans. Now there are several of this type, but I'm pointing out these three specifically because, and big point here, they go to very intentional lengths to point out that meat can somehow be obtained from certain Pokemon without hurting them in any way. Ultimately, with all this information put together, fishing as a food source in the way that we would know it seems to be a rare occurrence, and at most could be described as a regional activity of great responsibility in the instances where it does happen. But despite this rarity, in the games where fishers do appear, the characters are like flies swarming bodies of water for a chance at reeling something in, and conversations with these folks tend to revolve around raw passion, Pokemon battles, and the intricacies of the craft. People alluding to the trade as a food source are not non-existent though. Like this guy on Five Island and FireRed and LeafGreen is strongly implied to be catching his dinner, but they are exceedingly rare when compared to their formers. To me, these combined factors make for one of the biggest pieces of evidence that the strong majority of these characters are not classical hunters. Their enthusiasm and seeming communion with aquatic life has them positioned as something so much more. I'm still not yet exactly sure what that something is, but I think we're beginning to narrow things down. Another way that fishers distinguish themselves in this regard isn't something that they specifically do themselves, but rather the comparative behaviors of Pokemon criminals. Poaching and overconsumption are considered pretty high crimes in a world like this, and are a frequent behavior of Pokemon games' evil teams. You know, the whole big bad thing and all. Team Rocket in particular runs an operation of poaching and selling Pokemon to the front of a casino, and then later go even further, running an operation based around cutting off Slowpoke tails. It's truly dreadful stuff. While this is probably the most overtly cruel and specific example, simple Pokemon mistreatment is a staple of the older evil teams. It's one of the main things that attributes the title. We know these are the bad guys because of their cartoonishly villainous treatment of animals, which neatly wraps us back to fishing NPCs. These characters are not villains. Not in any way, shape, or form, otherwise the games would be hitting us over the head with how menacing they are to society. Rather, this is a craft and people that is public and celebrated just as much as any other in the world. Even though in name they are sort of defined as classical hunters, they must at the very least do so with a great respect for nature, and most likely operate in a way that poses no threat to it, just like the many other trainers littered around the worlds. Fishing NPCs, given their proximity to it, must uphold this world's values regarding nature and wildlife, otherwise they would be outcasts perceived much more negatively than their current framing within the series. And that idea itself is part of what I find the most interesting element of these characters. Not only is this an accepted way of life, but one that is also bursting with positivity, inclusion, and community. Fishers are some of the most excited and welcoming NPCs in Pokemon, very publicly inviting anyone willing to join in on the fun. And you as the player are uniquely roped in on the action as well. It's a classic Pokemon staple to walk into a stranger's house and be invited to partake in the great sport of fishing. I find it extremely noteworthy and beautiful in a way that fishing seems to be one of the least gatekept crafts in the Pokemon universe. Join me on the actual scene for a moment here, because all we have to do in Gen 1 is get to Vermilion City and head into this house next to the Pokemon Center, and you'll find this titan of industry. Sitting alone in a well-kept room, the fishing guru gets straight to the point. I'm the fishing guru. I simply love fishing. I can't bear to go without. Tell me, do you like to fish? And while this may come as a shock to some of you lovely viewers, I do indeed like to fish. And just like that, he has put a fishing rod in my hand, and we are absolute besties. And after that, we're treated to this beautiful speech. Fishing is a way of life. It is like the finest poetry. From the seas to the rivers, go out and land the big one, my friend. Wow. Just wow. Consider me surrounded by beauty after running into a guy like this. This is passion. This is fervor. This is what it's all about. And even further, we need to consider the context of this interaction. I just barged into this stranger's house and demanded a conversation, but no sooner had I done so than he had handed me a rod and christened our new friendship. And presumably, based on these circumstances, the guru welcomes everyone with arms this open. Anyone who walks through these doors is given everything needed to pursue the craft, all with the support of a kind and friendly teacher. Countless prospective fishers have no doubt walked through these doors and been introduced to the rest of their lives. Inclusion, and then further community, can be some of the biggest factors in driving passion for a hobby or a craft. These impassioned sages are nearly omnipresent across the mainline games, spreading a love for the craft with an emphasis on accessibility. I personally think this is one of the most noteworthy elements to this entire ecosystem, because maybe in some ways, it isn't the fishing itself at all. It's the positive energy and inclusion for the community that gets people invested and excited. Like, yeah, I personally think that fishing is pretty alright, but the thing that would actually get me to the pond and put my line in the water was having a mildly interested friend group I could do it alongside of. No one was especially passionate about the concept itself. I in particular have a certain aversion to touching them that was always an issue, but a willing group of friends molded that into something so much more. With the right community, we as a people can come together over just about anything, and I would say this is powerfully on display with Pokemon fishers. A functional community and sense of inclusion have created a sense of belonging and drive. They delight in the world of fishing because they have each other, and that is beautiful. The community aspect works as a springboard and method for sustaining the hobby, but what is there to be said for the passion itself? What drives the individual to fish? Well, most immediately, I would bring attention to the various size enthusiasts across the Pokemon world. While not a universal constant, these characters in Gen 3 and 4 are passionate simply about the idea of tangentially large Pokemon. I get a real mountain climber vibe from these guys, because they fish just because fish exist, and if fish exist, well, naturally, they'll need to find the biggest one. These guys dream of seeing unusually large fish, and it seems to boil down to just a pure love of the game. Wow. This one is outstanding! I tip my hat to you. I find this Magikarp Seeker at the Lake of Rage especially charming in this regard, because they do give you a prize for showing them never before seen largeness, but also tack on this little footnote to the gift. The record is the important thing. Think of that item as a bonus, which is such a beautiful sentiment. Of course he's gracious and thankful, but the most important thing to this character is the pure essence of the fishing game itself. An earnest dedication to large Magikarp. For this is the reason why he fishes. But as much as the sport is pure, there is always at least something of a competitive angle to it. The quest for finding the biggest fish is very much a competition at the end of the day. Whether you're going up against nature, your own personal best, or other anglers, the basic goal is to win. I would describe this as the final and perhaps ultimate motivation of the Pokemon Fishing NPC, which is, of course, a very common motivator in the Pokemon world. There's nothing unique about it. So much of the series' framing revolves around the burning desire to be victorious. But what is incredibly noteworthy about fishing NPCs in this regard is that they show us a motivation to win in an entirely different way. These characters show us what it means to try and win at a skill. You don't necessarily have to beat someone else, because there is no binary of victory in a craft like this. Instead, there's an entire spectrum of excellence. There's ongoing work to catch the next biggest, rarest, or strongest fish. By virtue of the wider Pokemon scenario, battle is as necessary of a premise as it always is, but the fishers lend it their unique perspective whenever a fight happens to take place. The raw idea of a Pokemon battle is still in place. You do fight them, but fishing NPCs seem more concerned with showing off the fruits of their labor rather than getting in a tussle when approached by other trainers. Battles are like a showcase for their strongest and rarest catches, and their battle teams are no doubt the careful result of lots of catch and release. As such, these battles are merely a vehicle for showing the brilliance of their art to the people of the world around them. Like, look at this. It probably goes without appreciation most of the time, but these are some of the only trainers to be consistently pointed away from you while you're journeying. Unlike a Lass or Ace trainer desperate to get a piece of you, these trainers are clearly focused on something other than battles. You'll even find some testiness and frustration here and there when you rope them into a fight, which, even if kind of curt, is definitely a fair response. They're actively involved with something else. It's just a very unique genre of interaction for a Pokemon game, because usually everyone is so kind and enthusiastic, but sometimes an angler will give you that slightly jaded rudeness you can only get working behind the counter at a service job. Go on. Don't be shy about going up to people to hear what they have to say. Just don't you talk to me. Awesome. I just pulled this guy away from his fish, beat him in a battle, and now he's damn pissed. What's this guy have to say? Interesting opener. And just get Goldeen out of here real quick and see... Okay, maybe not this guy. The quest presented by these characters is absolutely a meaningful one too, and not just some vague search for art or beauty or power. By the numbers of the Pokemon world, fishing is an on-paper, statistically valuable pastime. A lot of the rarest and strongest Pokemon in the entire series can only be found with intimate knowledge and skill with a fishing rod. The Dragonite family is one of the prized jewels of the Kanto region, and is considered to be on a level of rarity akin to a Mirage or a Myth. In the Hoenn and Sinnoh regions, Melodic is well known for its extreme elusiveness, and catching one requires an incredibly capable and skilled angler, but those who do will gain access to the creature's one-of-a-kind power. Trainers in Unova who can master fishing in the region's ripple spots will be able to grapple with a huge number of rare and unusual Pokemon that can't be found anywhere else, and those patient enough to handle chain fishing in the Kalos region will have a significantly easier time finding shinies than at the usual rates. So while there is a lot to be said for the personal benchmarking a hobby like fishing can offer the individual, we should also absolutely take note of how this quest to be the best is given extremely salient meaning in the Pokemon universe. Empirically speaking, fishing is another one of the great hunts for the legends of this world, and this absolutely must factor into the passion these characters have for the craft. And so while it takes on untraditional forms, we can safely say that these characters fish in a search for valor and merit. As expected, these are passionate, self-described artists in the way of fish, but to leave it at that would be a gross oversimplification of the nuance and depth in this vibrant community. So in conclusion, here's how I see it. From the evidence that we've gathered, these characters are primarily not classical hunters concerned with putting food on the table. There's too much presented societal context along with a very common catch and release attitude for this to be the case in simple terms. And it also seems to be very regular for members of this community to engage in the activity with a lens of friendly-ish competition. And that component is where the heart of the matter lies. Fishing in Pokemon seems to uniquely have a community and member base very much akin to those you would see in a real-world activity like speedrunning, where the driving force and difficulty of the activity arises through a player versus environment structure rather than one of player versus player. And while there is still plenty of room for competition, the relationship between anglers seems to be more like co-workers rather than absolute competitors, even with a common motivation of being the very best. Because, and I would say this is the big one for the entire investigation, the glue holding all of this together is community. While the spectrum of artistic drive for valor and merit motivates these NPCs as individuals, they are only sustained as a group by the sense of community and inclusion that permeates the hobby. Fishing is an extremely easy hobby to get involved in the Pokemon world because there are community members working to eliminate all hurdles to entry. And so all in all, the final answer to our question of why do they fish? It's because of the motivation to excel and show off their art, which is then sustained by a friendly and loving community, which is then sustained by the motivation to excel and show off their art. It's a beautiful and valiant feedback loop, and it's the heart of the Pokemon Fishing NPC. And that concludes today's Pokemon investigation. Thanks a load if you made it this far. Really hope you enjoyed this one, folks. I find it so interesting to try and rabbit hole facets of games like this, because when an interactive world exists like this one does, and has systems and cultures within it, I always find myself asking, why? To these things, just by virtue of their existence at all. Maybe there wasn't a lot of creator intent behind it at all. I imagine there wasn't a ton in this specific situation, but I find one of the richest and most stimulating ways we can engage with games is through that line of questioning, and a literal world of discovery will show itself to you. This one was a world of fish, but there's a million others out there for us to imagine and surmise. That's all I got for you this time, folks. Let me know all your fishing takes and hypotheses in the comments down below, and like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this one. It's been real, folks. I'll see y'all next time. Droomish out.